My father didn't raise his voice often. He didn't need to. He had a way of cutting through a room with a sentence so clean it left no blood on the floor, just silence. But that morning in courtroom 11C, he didn't bother with precision. "She never served," he said, each word sharpened by something close to contempt. "She stole our name. Every bit of it is a lie." The sound didn't echo, it landed. People turned, not slowly, all at once. A ripple of heads-eyes pens pausing mid-note. Someone in the back let out a quiet breath like they'd been waiting for exactly that line. I didn't look at him. I looked at the bench. At the woman seated above us in a dark robe, her posture still, her gaze unreadable. Judge Marion Vale had been quiet all morning. Not indifferent, there's a difference, but contained like someone holding a door closed against a storm no one else could hear. I didn't flinch, I didn't speak, I just watched her. And I waited. Because something in the way her eyes settled on me just for a fraction longer than necessary felt less like judgment and more like recognition. The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper that had been handled too many times. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a thin electric buzz that never quite disappeared even when people spoke. The air was cold in that institutional way, as if warmth had been deliberately engineered out of it. 6 feet separated me from the people who gave me life. On the plaintiff's side, Daniel Whitmore, my father, immaculate as always. Navy suit, crisp, white shirt, tie, knotted with practiced ease. His hair was silver now, but controlled, combed back in a way that suggested discipline rather than age. Beside him sat my mother Evelyn, pearl earrings, neutral expression, the same posture she used at charity luncheons, board meetings, funerals, appropriate, contained, untouchable. Their attorney stood just slightly forward, a man with coastal polish, and the easy confidence of someone who believed the story he was telling was already halfway to being accepted as truth. On the defense side, my side, there was only me. No stack of documents, no legal team flanking me, no carefully tabbed binders. Just a charcoal coat, my hair pulled back tight, and my hands folded in my lap so they wouldn't give away the small, involuntary tremor that lived somewhere beneath my skin. My uniform wasn't with me. It was folded at home, pressed clean, tucked inside a cedar chest at the foot of my bed. But I could still feel it, the weight of it, the seam of the shoulder patch that had once sat against my arm, the faint ghost of sand that never quite left your memory no matter how many times you washed. Kandahar had a smell, dust and heat and something metallic that clung to the back of your throat. That scent never really leaves you, even here. Even now. The bailiff called the case again, voice steady, practiced. Whitmore versus Whitmore. A pause followed. Not long, just long enough for the absurdity of it to settle in the room. My father leaned forward slightly, his hand resting on the table as if anchoring himself to something solid. When he spoke again, his voice had lowered, but it hadn't softened. "She's built an entire life on a fabrication," he said. "Military service that never happened. Records that don't exist, benefits she had no right to claim. She has used our name, my name, to give credibility to a lie." His lawyer picked up the thread smoothly. "Your Honor, we will demonstrate that the defendant has knowingly misrepresented herself as a United States Army officer. We will show that there is no verifiable record of her enlistment under her Social Security number in any publicly accessible Department of Defense database. We will show financial records." Paper slid across the table, a soft, deliberate sound, indicating she has received veteran-related benefits over a period of several years. "We will also present witness testimony suggesting a pattern of unstable behavior and attention-seeking narratives consistent with fabricated trauma." The words were clinical, clean. They had been chosen carefully. Unstable, fabricated, attention-seeking. Each one placed exactly where it would do the most damage. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. Silence, I had learned, unsettles people more than argument. It forces them to sit with what they've said instead of pushing against resistance. But to them, my silence meant something else. Guilt. Confession. Proof. I could feel it in the way people shifted in their seats, in the way a reporter in the second row tilted her head, pen poised as if she'd already decided which version of the story would be easier to write. Because on paper, my father's version made sense. On paper, I didn't exist. I was 18 when I left that house. Barely an adult. My head shaved down to something that felt more like a statement than a haircut. I remember standing in the doorway with a duffel bag slung over my shoulder, waiting for something I couldn't quite name. A hug, maybe. Or at least acknowledgement. My mother stood in the kitchen, her back partially turned, as if the angle itself could soften the moment into something less significant. My father didn't get up from his chair. "Just don't embarrass us," he said, not looking away from the paper in his hands. That was it. No ceremony, no pride, no question about where I was going or why. I told myself it didn't matter. That I was stepping into something bigger than that house, bigger than their approval. That one day I would come back with something they couldn't dismiss. I didn't understand then that dismissal wasn't about evidence. It was about willingness. And my father had never been willing to see me as anything other than a deviation from the version of a daughter he found acceptable. "Miss Whitmore," the judge's voice cut gently through the room, bringing me back. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice sounded steady, even to me. "You've chosen to represent yourself in this matter." "Yes, ma'am." A slight nod, no judgment in it, just acknowledgement. "And you understand the nature of the allegations being made against you?" "I do." Another pause. She studied me then. Not the way the others had, scanning for weakness, for cracks, but as if she were placing something, aligning it with a memory just out of reach. "Very well," she said finally. "We'll proceed." The prosecution continued. More documents, more language designed to sound definitive. No photographic evidence of service. No discharge papers available for independent verification. No commanding officer willing to come forward under her name. Each point landed like a nail being driven into something already assumed to be true. They were building a picture. A woman who had come back from nowhere with stories no one could confirm. A daughter who had always been difficult, now seeking validation through something dramatic enough to command attention. My father didn't look at me. Not once. He kept his gaze forward, his jaw set in that familiar line that used to mean he was disappointed. Now it meant something else. Determination. He believed this. Or maybe belief wasn't the right word. He had decided it was true. And that was enough. During a brief recess, I allowed myself a glance in his direction. He was sipping water from a clear bottle, his posture relaxed, almost satisfied. My mother leaned in slightly, whispering something I couldn't hear. Her hand rested lightly on his arm. They looked like a couple waiting for a verdict they were confident would go their way. As if this were routine. As if erasing me were just another item on a list of necessary corrections. I looked away first. Not because I couldn't hold his gaze, but because I no longer needed to. When the session resumed, their attorney stepped forward again, his voice carrying easily. "Your Honor, if the defendant truly served, there would be verifiable evidence. A unit, a record, a chain of command willing to confirm her claims. But instead we have silence." He turned just enough to gesture in my direction without fully facing me. "We have a narrative unsupported by fact. We have myth." A murmur moved through the room, subtle but present. I felt it, the shift. The weight of assumption settling into place. I didn't respond. I just lifted my eyes once more to the bench. Judge Marion Vale had gone very still. Her fingers rested against the wood, unmoving. Her gaze wasn't on the attorney anymore. It was on me. Not questioning. Not skeptical. Something else. Something older than this room. Slower. Heavier. As if somewhere beneath the layers of procedure and distance, she had just recognized a detail that didn't belong to a story, but to a memory. And for the first time since my father had opened his mouth that morning, I felt something shift. Not in the room. Not yet. But in the space between what was being said and what had actually happened. I held her gaze. And I waited. Because if there was one thing I had learned both in that house and far beyond it, it was this. Truth doesn't always arrive when it's called. But when it doesn't ask permission. I learned early that in my father's house, affection wasn't given, it was earned, itemized, and quietly withdrawn when it no longer served a purpose. There were rules, though no one ever wrote them down. You didn't ask questions that made people uncomfortable. You didn't contradict him in front of others. You didn't choose a path that reflected poorly on the name he had spent decades polishing. And above all, you didn't become something he couldn't explain. My brother Mason understood that instinctively. He moved through life like a well-rehearsed answer. Varsity letters, easy smile, a business degree from Duke that my father mentioned in conversations the way other people referenced weather casually, but often enough that everyone remembered. Mason knew how to be seen. I knew how to notice. Which in my father's world were not the same thing. I was the one who read too much, asked too many questions, and never quite mastered the art of softening my edges for other people's comfort. In family photos, I stood where I was told, but I didn't lean in. I didn't perform closeness I didn't feel. That alone was enough to mark me as difficult. By the time I was 16, the gap between what my father expected and who I actually was had widened into something unspoken but permanent. He stopped correcting me, stopped advising, stopped trying. It wasn't acceptance. It was disengagement. When I enlisted, he called it a phase. Rebellion has a way of burning itself out, he told one of his colleagues over dinner, as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. She'll come back to something more. Appropriate. Appropriate. It was his favorite word for anything that fit inside his understanding of the world. The Army didn't. I didn't enlist to prove him wrong. Not exactly. I enlisted because it was the first thing that felt real, something that didn't depend on his approval or his interpretation, something with consequences that couldn't be negotiated away over a polite conversation. Basic training stripped everything down: name, hair, habits, assumptions. What was left was simpler, harder, more honest. There's a clarity in being pushed past your limits by people who don't care who your father is. No one there knew the Whitmore name. No one cared. For the first time, that felt like relief. The first deployment came faster than I expected. Kandahar wasn't what people imagine when they hear it spoken from a distance. It wasn't a single place. It was layers of dust and heat and tension that never fully dissipated. The air itself felt alert, as if it were waiting for something to break. I wasn't infantry. I wasn't leading patrols through villages or clearing buildings. I was attached to a medical evacuation unit operating in coordination with routes that didn't appear on standard maps. Our job was simple in theory: get in, stabilize, get out. In practice, it meant arriving at the worst moments of someone else's day, sometimes of their life. You don't remember every face. You can't. Your mind learns to protect itself in ways you don't notice until later. But you remember details, a voice, a hand gripping yours too tightly, the way someone says your name when they're trying not to panic. You remember the wait, always the wait. The night everything changed didn't announce itself. Convoys don't come with warnings, they come with routine, repetition, the false comfort of doing something enough times that it starts to feel predictable. We were 3 vehicles deep when the blast hit. The sound was wrong, not louder than expected, just closer, immediate in a way that bypassed thought and went straight to reaction. Training took over. Movement, assessment, triage. There was no time to process anything beyond what was in front of you, no space for fear. That came later if it came at all. I remember the heat first, then the smell burnt metal, something sharper underneath it. Someone shouting coordinates, someone else calling out for a medic who wasn't answering. And then I was moving. Hands on a body, pressure where there was too much blood, instructions I didn't remember forming leaving my mouth like they had been waiting there all along. Stay with me. Don't close your eyes. Look at me. I said those things to strangers, to people whose names I didn't know, whose lives I would never see beyond that moment. But that night one of those faces stayed. Not because it was different, because of what came after. I didn't talk about Kandahar when I came home. Not because I didn't want to, because there was nowhere for it to go. You can't place that kind of experience into a room where people are discussing dinner plans and social calendars. It doesn't fit. It sits there heavy and out of place until someone changes the subject or pretends it was never brought up. So I learned not to bring it up. 3 years passed before I returned home for more than a few days at a time. By then, the fractures had settled into something stable, predictable. I arrived with a duffel bag, a letter of commendation, and a bronze star tucked into the inner pocket of my coat. I didn't lead with any of it. I knocked on the door like a guest. My mother answered. She looked at me through the peephole first. I could hear the faint shift of weight on the other side before the door opened halfway. "Oh," she said, "you're back." No surprise, no relief, just acknowledgement. I stepped inside. The house smelled the same, lemon cleaner, something baked earlier in the day, the quiet hum of central air. My father was in the living room seated in his usual chair. He looked up briefly. "Do you still have health insurance?" he asked. That was his first question. Not where I had been, not what had happened. Logistics. Practicalities. Things he could categorize and resolve. I stood there for a moment waiting for something else to follow. It didn't. I stayed a week. Long enough to confirm what I had already suspected. Nothing in that house had shifted to accommodate who I had become. There was no space for it, no curiosity, no attempt to reconcile the version of me they had held onto with the person standing in front of them. At dinner, conversations flowed around me. Mason's new job, a charity event my mother was organizing, a colleague of my father's who had recently published something worth reading. No one asked about the army. Not directly. Not indirectly. It was as if that part of my life existed behind glass. Visible, perhaps, but not something they were willing to touch. After a while, I stopped expecting them to. When I moved out, it wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no ultimatum. Just a quiet decision made over coffee in the early morning, the kind where the light comes in through the window at an angle that makes everything feel temporarily clear. I found a small studio near the river. The floors creaked, the walls were thin, but it was mine. I volunteered at a trauma clinic that didn't ask for explanations. They didn't need them. The people who came through those doors carried their own versions of silence. There was an understanding there that didn't require translation. Through a legal aid group, I filed for veteran benefits. It wasn't straightforward. Parts of my service record had been processed through channels that didn't align cleanly with civilian databases. There were notations, flags, references to classifications I didn't have clearance to revisit. But eventually, with enough documentation and enough patience, the system recognized what it needed to. Or at least enough of it. I didn't push further. I wasn't looking for recognition. Just stability. The letter arrived on a gray morning in January. Certified mail. My name written in a hand I recognized immediately. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, the envelope still sealed something tight forming in my chest that I couldn't quite name. When I opened it, the language was exactly what I expected. Formal, precise, distant. Daniel Whitmore versus Elena Whitmore. The claim was laid out in clean, structured paragraphs. Accusations of fraud, identity misrepresentation, unauthorized receipt of benefits, damage to family reputation. It read less like a father addressing his daughter and more like a man correcting a public record. I sat down at the small kitchen table and read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it the first time. Because part of me still believed there had to be something I was missing. A misunderstanding, a miscommunication. Something that could be resolved with a conversation. But there was no invitation to talk. No request for clarification. Just a summons. He hadn't just chosen not to see me. He had chosen to define me. In a way that made my existence inconvenient. And then he had decided to remove that inconvenience. Legally. Publicly. Permanently. I didn't feel anger right away. That came later. What I felt first was something quieter. Colder. Like a realization settling into place after years of being just out of reach. My father didn't need me to be a liar because he believed I was one. He needed me to be a liar because the alternative required him to confront something he had spent too long avoiding. Something about who I had become. Or who he had been when I needed him to see me. Back in the courtroom, as their attorney finished outlining his argument, I could feel the weight of that realization sitting just beneath the surface. They had spent years erasing me in private. Now they were asking the court to make it official. To turn absence into evidence. To turn silence into proof. I lifted my eyes once more to the bench. Judge Marion Vale hadn't moved. But something in her expression had shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Like a memory pressing forward against restraint. And for the first time since this began, I understood something with complete clarity. My father wasn't the only one in this room who knew more than they were saying. The afternoon light shifted just enough to turn the courtroom windows into pale mirrors. Faces blurred against the glass spectators, reporters, the quiet outline of a cousin I hadn't seen since I was 15. Everyone watching a story they thought they understood. On paper it was simple. A father correcting a lie. A daughter exposed. That was the version being built piece by piece with careful language and well-placed doubt. And I was sitting at the center of it, silent. "Your Honor," my father's attorney said, stepping forward with a file in his hand, "we'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit 7. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He didn't need to. This is a certified report from a civilian-accessible Department of Defense database. We conducted a search using the defendant's social security number and full legal name. There is no record of enlistment, no active duty history, no discharge documentation available through standard verification channels." He let that settle. "No record," he repeated. The phrase echoed differently the second time. Not just an absence, a conclusion. The kind people were trained to trust. A few heads nodded, subtle, controlled, the way people agree without wanting to seem too eager. I didn't move. Additionally, he continued, "We have obtained financial statements indicating that the defendant has received monthly deposits associated with veteran assistance programs, housing credits, therapy subsidies, benefits designated for individuals with verified service-related trauma." He placed another document down. "The question before the court is not merely whether these benefits were received, it is whether they were received under false pretenses." False pretenses. I felt the words pass over me like something cold. Not sharp, not immediate. Just steady. "Miss Whitmore," he said, turning toward me for the first time, "would you care to explain to the court how you obtained these benefits?" The room quieted. It wasn't loud before, but this was different. Focused. Anticipating. I could feel it, every pair of eyes, every assumption waiting for confirmation. I lifted my head. "I filed through a legal aid group," I said. My voice carried evenly, "using the documentation available to me. And that documentation would be," he pressed. "Restricted," I said. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not surprise. Opportunity. "Restricted," he repeated as if testing the word. "So the court is expected to accept that your entire claim to military service rests on documents that cannot be independently verified." I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't have one. Because I knew how it would sound. "Yes," I said. A murmur moved through the room, louder this time, less controlled. I heard someone shift in their seat, a pen scratching faster across paper. The narrative was tightening. My father leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. This was what he had been waiting for. A moment that sounded like confirmation. He didn't smile. He never did not in situations like this, but there was a stillness in him that I recognized. Satisfaction held carefully beneath the surface. "Let's be clear," the attorney said, his tone sharpening just enough to draw a line. "You are asking this court to believe that you served in the United States Army in a capacity significant enough to warrant both commendation and ongoing benefits. Yet there is no publicly accessible record of your service, no unit willing to come forward under your name, no commanding officer prepared to testify." He paused. "No verifiable evidence." He let the silence do the rest. "Just your word." Just your word. I let the phrase sit there. It sounded smaller than it was, less than what it carried. Because my word wasn't just a statement. It was the sum of everything I had done in places no one in that room had ever seen. Everything I couldn't bring into this space without breaking something I had sworn to protect. But none of that translated here. Here it was absence. Here it was doubt. I shifted slightly in my chair, my hand still folded, my posture unchanged. Across the room, a reporter leaned forward, eyes narrowed as if trying to catch the exact moment I would break. I didn't give it to her. The judge hadn't spoken. Not since the questioning began. But I could feel her attention. Not the kind that watches for mistakes. the kind that listens for something beneath the words. Miss Whitmore, the attorney continued, if you truly served, there would be people living verifiable individuals who could confirm your presence, your role, your actions. He took a step closer. Where are they? The question landed harder than the others. Not because I didn't have an answer. Because I did. Too many. Faces, voices, names that came with images I didn't let myself revisit unless I had to. Some of them were gone. Some of them had moved on into lives that didn't include courtrooms and public testimony. And some of them were tied to operations that were never meant to be discussed outside very specific channels. I looked up, not at him, at the bench, at Judge Marion Vale. Her expression hadn't changed, but her hand had. It rested against the wood of the bench, fingers slightly curled as if holding on to something. I'm here, I said quietly. It wasn't the answer he wanted. He frowned slightly. I'm sorry. I'm here, I repeated. That's not what I asked, he said, a note of impatience slipping through. No, I said, it isn't. I held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to let him see that I understood exactly what he was doing. Then I looked back at the judge. There was a shift. Small, but real. Her eyes moved not away from me but inward as if aligning something. A detail. A memory. Something that had been out of place until now. Your Honor, the attorney said, turning back toward the bench, the plaintiff's position remains clear. Without verifiable evidence, the defendant's claims amount to narrative. And narrative, no matter how compelling, does not meet the standard required for the benefits she has received or the identity she has constructed. Narrative. My life reduced to a story. Something told. Something doubted. Something optional. The judge inhaled slowly. I saw it, the rise and fall of her shoulders, controlled, deliberate. She glanced down at the documents in front of her, then back up. Not at the attorney. At me. Miss Whitmore, she said, her voice, even during your service, were you ever assigned to a unit operating outside standard reporting structures? The question landed differently. Not for the room. For me. Yes, ma'am, I said. A flicker again, subtle but unmistakable. Can you elaborate, she asked. No, ma'am. Another pause. Not because you are unwilling, she said. No, ma'am. Because you are unable. Yes, ma'am. The room shifted again. Confusion this time, unease. This wasn't following the expected path. She nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to herself. Was there, she continued, an incident involving a convoy and an IED detonation during your time in Kandahar? The air changed. Not dramatically, but enough. I felt it in my chest before I fully processed the words. Yes, ma'am, I said. My voice didn't waver, but something inside me did. Following that incident, she said, were you involved in providing immediate medical intervention to personnel on site? The memory came back sharper this time. Heat, noise, the weight of someone in my hands. Yes, ma'am. Her gaze held mine. Do you recall she asked a secondary extraction involving a legal liaison attached to the operation? The room was quiet. Too quiet. Because no one else understood what she was asking. But I did. I swallowed once. Her arm was hit, I said, high on the shoulder, arterial bleed. We had to stabilize before airlift. A pause. She kept asking for a report log, I added. Wouldn't let it go even when she was fading. The corner of the judge's mouth moved. Not a smile. Recognition. I remember, she said softly. The words didn't carry far. But they didn't need to. They weren't for the room. They were for me. The attorney shifted, clearly uncertain. Your Honor, I'm not sure how this line of questioning. She raised a hand. He stopped. Not because he agreed. Because something in her tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. She looked back down at the bench for a moment. Then up again. Her eyes steadier now. Resolved. Counselor, she said, her voice returning to its formal cadence, you asked where the proof was. A pause. You may want to reconsider the scope of that question. The room held its breath. And for the first time since the case began, The version of the story my father had built, clean, controlled, unquestioned, began to show the first fine fracture. The fracture didn't sound like anything at first. No crack, no sharp intake of breath. Just a subtle misalignment in the rhythm of the room, like a metronome slipping half a beat off time. People felt it before they understood it. You could see it in the way shoulders stiffened, in the way the attorney's confidence shifted into something more cautious, more deliberate. My father noticed it too. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers pressing into the table, his posture tightening not in panic but in control. He was recalculating, adjusting, the way he always did when a conversation didn't move in the direction he intended. But this wasn't a conversation, and it wasn't his room anymore. "Your Honor," his attorney began, forcing a lightness into his tone that didn't quite hold with respect. Anecdotal recollections, however sincere, cannot substitute for verifiable documentation. The court must rely on... Counselor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The single word settled over the room with a weight that pressed everything else down. He stopped. Not mid-sentence, mid-thought. Judge Marion Vale didn't look at him. She looked at me. And for the first time since the proceedings began, she didn't look like a judge weighing arguments. She looked like someone remembering something she had tried very hard not to forget. "You asked where the proof was," she said again, slower this time, each word placed with care. "You asked for a verifiable account, a witness, a confirmation that could withstand scrutiny." She rose to her feet. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. The kind of motion that doesn't seek attention but commands it anyway. The room shifted with her. Chairs creaked. Someone in the back straightened instinctively, as if called to attention by something older than protocol. My father's attorney glanced at the clerk, then back at the bench, uncertainty now visible in the tightness around his eyes. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not," she said. Still calm. Still measured. But final. She stepped forward from behind the bench. That alone was enough to break the rhythm of the room. Judges don't do that. They remain elevated, removed, contained within the structure of the proceedings. She didn't. She moved into the space, into the same air we were breathing. And then slowly she reached for the front of her robe. The fabric was dark, heavy, designed to conceal, to standardize, to strip away individuality in favor of authority. Her fingers found the fastening at the collar. There was a moment, brief, suspended, where no one seemed to understand what was happening. And then she undid it. One motion. Clean. She slipped the robe from her shoulders. The sound it made as it fell was soft, almost nothing. But the absence it created, that was loud. Beneath the robe, she wore a simple blouse, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the line of her forearm. And there, just below the shoulder where the fabric pulled back slightly as she moved. A scar. Not recent, not clean.
Old.
The kind that doesn't fade completely no matter how much time passes. The kind that tells a story without needing to be explained. "This," she said, her voice steady as what you're asking me to disregard. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if it were waiting. "I did not intend," she continued, "to introduce personal history into these proceedings. It is not standard practice, it is not encouraged, and it is not something I take lightly." Her gaze shifted then. From me. To my father. "For the record," she said, "I will clarify the relevance." She took another step forward. "Years ago, before I ever wore this robe, before I ever sat on this bench, I was assigned as a legal liaison to a joint operation in Kandahar. My role was observational, administrative, detached." A pause. That detachment did not survive contact with reality. I didn't breathe. Not fully. Because I knew where she was going. And I knew what it would cost her to say it. "There was an incident," she said, "a convoy, an IED detonation, immediate casualties." Her hand lifted almost unconsciously toward the scar. "I was not meant to be in the primary response zone. I was not equipped for it. I was not trained for it." Another pause. "But I was there." Her eyes met mine. "And I would not be here now if she hadn't been." The room broke. Not into chaos. Into silence so complete it felt like something had been removed. Sound, movement, certainty. All of it. Gone. The defendant, she said, her voice tightening just enough to carry something beneath the control, was the first to reach me. She identified the injury, applied pressure, stabilized the bleed long enough for evacuation. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. She did not ask who I was. She did not hesitate. She did not wait for instruction. A breath. She acted. My father shifted. It was small, barely noticeable. But I saw it. The first crack. Not in the story. In him. I have the scar, she said. I have the medical record. And I have the memory of a young officer who held an artery closed with her hands while everything around us burned. She let that settle. Not as a statement. As fact. The woman you have described to this court as unstable, as fraudulent as attention-seeking, her voice sharpened just slightly, is the reason I lived long enough to become the judge you now stand before. No one wrote. No one whispered. Even the reporters had stopped moving. Because this wasn't something you captured in shorthand. This was something you witnessed. My father's attorney opened his mouth, closed it. Tried again. Your Honor, with respect, this is highly irregular. Personal testimony of this nature is admissible, she said, when it directly addresses the credibility of the claims being made. She stepped back then, but not behind the bench. Not yet. And if you require documentation, she added, you will receive it. As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened. The sound was quiet, but in that silence it carried. A clerk entered, moving quickly, but without urgency, a sealed envelope in hand. Delivery for the court, he said. The judge nodded. The envelope was placed on the bench. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at my father. Really looked at him. Not as a plaintiff. As a man. You have asked this court to determine whether your daughter is who she claims to be, she said. Her voice had returned to its formal cadence. Controlled, precise. But there was something under it now. Something that hadn't been there before. You have asserted repeatedly and publicly that she has constructed an identity based on fabrication. A pause. And you have done so with conviction. She opened the envelope. Paper slid free. Official, stamped, marked in a way that didn't belong to civilian systems. These documents, she said, scanning them briefly, have been released under an emergency declassification order, authorized within the last 12 hours. A ripple moved through the room. Sharp this time. Uncontained. Service records, she continued. Deployment logs, commendations, chain of command verification. She lifted one page slightly. And a field report bearing the signature of the commanding officer present at the Kandahar incident in question. Her eyes lifted, which aligns with the testimony I have just provided. My father didn't move. Not immediately. But something in his posture had changed. The certainty. Gone. Replaced by something harder to name. Not disbelief. Recognition. The kind that comes too late. You asked for proof, she said one last time. Her gaze didn't leave his. You have it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Of everything that had just been said. Of everything that could no longer be unsaid. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I just exhaled. Slowly. Carefully. As if I had been holding something in place for years, and had finally been given permission to let it go. The robe lay where she had left it, folded into nothing. Authority momentarily set aside. Truth standing in its place. And across the room my father sat very still. For the first time in my life, he looked like a man who had run out of ways to control what came next. The ruling itself didn't come with drama. No gavel slammed, no raised voices, no moment crafted for spectacle. Judge Marion Vale returned to the bench, the robe back in place, not as concealment, but as structure. The room shifted with her reforming around the familiar lines of procedure. But something essential had already changed. You could feel it in the way no one leaned back into comfort. The case was dismissed with prejudice. The words were precise, final. Not just a loss for the plaintiff, but a closure of the path he had chosen. There would be no refiling, no second attempt to reshape the narrative through a different angle. My father's version of me had just been denied the one thing he trusted most: legal permanence. There was a brief discussion of potential sanctions language, about abuse of process, reputational harm, the misuse of the court as an instrument of personal correction. His attorney tried to recover ground, to reframe the intention as concern, as confusion, as a family matter taken too far. It didn't land. The judge listened, acknowledged, then moved forward. There are moments when a system reveals exactly what it can and cannot do. It could clear my name. It could not repair what had been broken long before we entered that room. People began to move. Chairs shifted, papers gathered, the low murmur of voices returning tentative at first, then more certain as the structure of the courtroom reasserted itself. A young woman in uniform stood near the aisle, her posture straight, her expression composed. When I stepped past her, she raised her hand in a quiet, respectful salute. I returned it with a nod. Nothing more. Nothing needed. Behind me, someone whispered my name, not loudly, not for attention, but as if confirming it existed. Elena Whitmore. For a long time, hearing it in public had felt like exposure. Now it felt neutral, like something that no longer required defense. I didn't wait for my father to approach. I didn't look for him. But as I reached the doors, I felt it, the shift in the air that comes when someone is watching you with intention. I paused. Not out of obligation. Out of clarity. Then I turned. He was still seated. The room had emptied around him in a way that made the space feel larger than it was. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her posture unchanged, though her eyes had lost their usual focus. My father's gaze met mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There were 1,000 things he could have said. Explanations, justifications, a version of apology that never quite used the word. He had always been good with language, always able to shape it into something that sounded reasonable even when it wasn't. But now there was nothing left to shape. "You made this public," he said finally. Not loud, not angry, just a statement. As if that were the part he couldn't reconcile. I held his gaze. "No," I said, "you did." The silence that followed wasn't sharp. It was hollow. He looked at me for a second longer, as if searching for something he recognized. Then he nodded. Once. A small movement. Not agreement. Not acceptance. Just acknowledgement that the conversation, whatever it had been, was over. I didn't wait for more. I turned and walked out. Outside, the air was thick with late afternoon heat. Humidity pressed against my skin, grounding in a way the sterile cold of the courtroom never could be. Reporters had gathered near the steps, microphones, cameras, questions already forming in their posture before they were spoken. "Captain Whitmore, do you have a statement? Can you respond to the allegations?" I kept walking. Not because I didn't have answers, because I didn't need to give them here. Not anymore. The truth had already arrived. It didn't require amplification. That night, I stood in my apartment, the window cracked just enough to let the city's distant noise filter in. A siren somewhere far off. The low hum of traffic. Life continuing in a rhythm that had nothing to do with what had happened that day. I poured a glass of water, set it down, and let the quiet settle. I had imagined this moment before. The end of it. What it would feel like to have everything laid out, confirmed, validated. I thought it would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt like absence. Like something that had occupied too much space for too long had finally been removed. Not replaced. Just gone. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Heavy paper, my father's handwriting. I recognized it before I opened it. Inside, the language was exactly what I expected. Measured, formal. There was mention of regret, of misinterpretation, of the complexities of family dynamics under pressure. He signed it. Daniel Whitmore. No dad. No attempt to bridge the distance. Just a name. The same way he had addressed me in the lawsuit. I read the first paragraph. Then I stopped, folded the paper, and set it aside. Not out of anger. Out of understanding. Some people don't apologize. They revise. And I was no longer interested in revisions. I moved 3 months later. A small house in western North Carolina just beyond the edge of a forest that seemed to breathe on its own. The kind of place where the air changed with the time of day, where silence wasn't empty, but full of small steady sounds, whined through trees, water moving somewhere you couldn't quite see. I found work at a regional veterans clinic. No title on the door. No nameplate. Just Elena. Most of the people who came through didn't ask about my past. They didn't need to. They carried their own. The smell of diesel that made someone pause mid-sentence, the way a sudden noise shifted a room without explanation, the quiet understanding that some stories are told in fragments and some are never spoken at all. I listened. Sometimes that was enough. One evening after a long day, I stepped outside and sat on the bench I had built behind the house. The sky was clear. Stars, sharp and unfiltered, spread across it in a way you don't see in cities. I held a photograph in my hand. Grainy, old. Me kneeling beside a vehicle that no longer existed, my hands stained my expression set in a way I barely recognized. In the corner, barely legible. Vale. She had sent it without a note. No explanation. She didn't need one. I placed the photo on the small shelf inside above the fireplace. Not next to medals. Not as a display. Just where I could see it. A reminder. Not of what I had proven. Of what I had lived. I don't measure time the same way anymore. Not by deployments. Not by court dates. Not by the absence of calls that never came. I measure it by quieter things now. How long the light lingers on the porch in late afternoon. The shift in the wind before a storm. The way my name feels when I say it out loud. Elena Whitmore. Not as something I have to defend. As something that simply is. My father never called. I don't know if he read the full ruling. I don't know if he understands what he did, or if he's found a version of the story that lets him keep moving without looking too closely. It doesn't matter. Closure isn't always an apology. Sometimes it's the absence of the need for one. If you've ever had someone try to rewrite who you are quietly, persistently, until even you start to question it, then you understand something most people don't. The truth doesn't always arrive loudly. It doesn't always come with recognition or applause. Sometimes it shows up in a room where no one expects it and refuses to leave. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to stand still while someone else tried to define your life for you, I'd like to hear where you're listening from. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. There are more stories like this. Stories about truth, about silence, about the moments that change everything in ways no one sees coming. Subscribe if you want to stay with us. We're just getting started.